Hello, and welcome back to my channel, because today, August 9th, 2022, is the 77th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. I will be discussing this book, which I recently read and have been speaking about in several videos, Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War by Susan Southard. And because today is the anniversary, I'm wearing my peace t-shirt and also put one of my earrings, my little dove pendant, which I normally wear on a necklace, into a little hoop and hook that through one of my earrings. This one is an 8 gauge, by the way. If you're wondering, I am stretching my ears, something I thought I would never do. So that's a long story for another topic. So let's just start discussing the book, and we'll start with the reading with the synopsis. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, 3 days after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the people of Nagasaki began another day of wartime routine. A 15-year-old girl waved goodbye to her mother and siblings before heading to her shift at an airplane parts factory. A boy, just 13, walked to school with his friends and stopped at a roadside well for some water. Above them, an American B-29 bomber approached the city, carrying a 5-ton plutonium bomb. At 11:02 a.m., a brilliant flash illuminated the sky, followed by an explosion equal to 21,000 tons of TNT. With searing heat and an annihilating force that defies imagination, the blast tore through factories, shops, and homes, carrying unprecedented levels of radiation that penetrated the bodies of human beings and animals. An estimated 74,000 people were killed, and another 75,000 were wounded. For much of the world, the atomic bombings represented an end to a long and costly global war. But for tens of thousands of survivors who barely escaped death beneath the mushroom cloud, their new lives as hibakusha, atomic bomb-affected people, had just begun. Susan Southard spent more than a decade researching and interviewing hibakusha and atomic bomb historians, physicians, and specialists to reconstruct the days, months, and years after the bombing. Using powerful eyewitness accounts, Southard unveils the neglected story of the enduring impact of nuclear war. Nagasaki takes us on the astonishing journeys of 5 survivors, all teenagers at the time of the bombing. From 1945 to Nagasaki today, we watch them and other hibakusha across the city navigate an uncertain future with punishing injuries, acute and late-onset radiation-related illnesses, and haunting fears that they would pass on genetic disorders to their children and grandchildren. In a remarkable act of human resilience, even as U.S. policies kept their suffering hidden in their own country and around the world, a small number of survivors made the very personal choice to speak out about their experiences. Their goal is to ensure that Nagasaki remains the last atomic bombed city in history. And now, as mentioned the synopsis, she's following the lives of 5 teenagers, and she has a brief little note at the beginning saying she's following the Japanese custom of putting the family name, the surname before the first name, which I obviously, understand, respect the culture you're writing about, but that felt a little bit impersonal to me at some times, because particularly when you're talking about someone as young as 13, barely more than a child, you want to connect with them with on a first name basis. And for one of the 2 women she writes about, she's using her married surname even when she was using her birth surname before she married, and so that was felt kind of inaccurate and confusing. I just personally prefer to read about people with their first name, even if it's an adult or what a famous person, just personally connects me more. The referring to the last name is more something you do in a research paper, or talking about someone on a detached level, or an author who wrote the book, instead of following them on their story. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling, but that was just a little bit of a pet peeve to me. And so anyway, the people which we follow are Koichi Wada, who is 18 in 1945. Oh, I'm sorry, I am putting the first name before the last name because obviously that's more familiar to the Westerners, even though the author does put the last name before the first name. So she would refer to this person as Wadi Koichi, and he was a streetcar operator. He was an orphan who lived with his grandparents, and that made him feel responsible from a very young age, and he was very anti-war. Obviously, Japan was heavily militarized at this point, and it was basically, kind of against the law and such for, to express anti-war sentiments. And so he made the really, very difficult, brave step. He deliberately failed his military physical. When he turned 18, he wore glasses, which wasn't an automatic deferment, but he pretended to be, almost blind so he wouldn't go into the military. And so instead he began operating a streetcar, and a lot of people, even though he had the legitimate military exception, they were treated him quite horribly, beating him up and cursing and spitting and such, but he didn't care. He just, kept on doing his job, and his life was saved on the day of the bombing because there was a derailment of another streetcar, and so he and his friends, hung out at another station chatting and such until the bomb happened. And he had been on his like regular route, he probably would have been killed or more severely injured by the bomb. And the second person she writes is Etsuko Kanazawa, who later became Nagano. She married a cousin by marriage, not I'm sorry, a cousin by adoption. Her mother didn't like any of the men she brought home whom she was dating, and she finally gave up to her the Japanese culture, so like obey your parents no matter what, and married this cousin because her mother wouldn't approve of any men of her own choice. Anyway, she was 16 in 1945. She worked in an airplane parts factory, and this was like really, I kind of like knew what was going to happen. I hated knowing it, and it unfortunately did happen. She brought her two youngest siblings home. Her grandparents had sent them to live with their grandparents in another city for safety during the war, and she was like, really, really missing them. And her mother said, okay, go on the train and bring them home, but only if they really want to go. And the grandparents didn't want to part from them, and the siblings themselves were like happy with their new friends and their school. But Etsuko like brought them on the train and took them home anyway, and obviously they were there when the bomb dropped, and she felt like horrible guilt for the rest of her life because she was indirectly responsible for her siblings' deaths, and her mother was also like very angry at her too, like kind of like blaming, not, she never like explicitly said you killed them, but obviously like there was like a chill between them. They had never had like an easy relationship anyway, but like after that it was even like more difficult between them. And then the third one is Mineko Doo, who was 15 in 1945. She was a total tomboy growing up, so I really related to her, and she absolutely loved fashion. She later moved to Tokyo and became like a really high-ranking woman executive, which was like almost unheard of at the time. And she wore like really extreme, like expressive clothes. Like some people were even complaining, like, oh, you're showing up to like talk as a hibakusha dressed all in red or with like cheetah print or like gigantic earrings. What will the children think of you? And she's like, oh, are all hibakushas supposed to look alike? And she absolutely loved designing her own clothes from a young age and like making unique fashions. And she absolutely thrived in the fashion industry, even though she, deliberately chose never to get married and have children, which was also like really like unusual for a Japanese woman in that era. She did like meet with one guy when she was in her 30s, and after he found out she was a hibakusha, kind of went sour. But there's like kind of like a stigma against hibakusha, unfortunately, even to this day. So many of them have like hidden their hibakusha status because they were afraid they wouldn't make like a good marriage or be accepted for a good job or go to school or something. It's hopefully that will eventually change while we still have hibakusha living. And the fourth is Sumiteru Taniguchi, who was 16 in 1945 and who was raised by his grandparents, although his mother was still alive. And he was a post office delivery boy, like making deliveries on his bike when it happened. And he was severely burnt on his back and face. And there was like some famous pictures of him, lying face down on the tatami mat, which began to rot. And there were actually like holes in his body, and it like parts of like flesh was just like rotting off, just really horrible. His entire back and buttocks, just his arms, like pretty much everything was horribly burnt, and he didn't even like realize these pictures existed until he saw them in like Life magazine many decades later. And now he later became like not proud, I guess, but just like open about it, like showing his pictures, like this is what like nuclear war can do, and like this is what happened to me, and I'm not ashamed of it. And the last is Katsuji Yoshida, who was 13 in 1945. He was a student. He was burnt on his face, and just like again horrible burns in his right ear eventually just fell off, and he was like very self-conscious about his appearance. And like later one of his sons was like saying, oh, my daddy was hurt by the atomic bomb, it's nothing scary, when a friend was saying, oh, your father has a horrible face. And he was so proud of his son and felt like those words saved him because he'd been totally open and honest with his children. And the other ones who did marry, obviously they were worried their spouses might judge them, and particularly Taniguchi, who was like, his wife did not know the truth about the full extent of his burns until after they were married, and she was like shocked and kind of angry. She had been lied to, and she was set up with this guy, but she like grew to accept him and realize like who else is going to take care of him. And they like had good marriages, all of them, and like raised their children well. They did have lives after the bomb. And so after the bombing, obviously I'm not going to like do a full like blow graphic explanation of everything that happened. You can read that in other books, but it was just absolutely horrible. Like burns, as I keep mentioning, like the skin was like like hanging off of them and like shreds, and if you touched someone, like the skin would come off even further, and like glass would go into your back, or like strands of grass would, like, act like projectiles and go into your skin, just like all these like horrible things if you weren't like killed instantly. And so they had to be, carried on broken off doors and in proms to take into the doctor back home or like wherever they were going to be like medical treatment. It was just absolutely horrible, and the doctors had to work by candlelight because obviously like the hospitals were destroyed, or if they weren't completely destroyed, like a lot of the medicines, the beds were, so they were just like piled up in the courtyards and outside waiting, and there was obviously no anesthesia, and the ointments they had to use, if like there was none left, which usually there weren't, they would include things like sesame oil, like machine oil, motor oil, like water, a mixture of like ashes and machine oil, pumpkin juice, like cooking oil, zinc oxide, which is used in diaper cream, but I guess it could work for treating burns and in like an extreme emergency, and sometimes Vaseline. And unfortunately, the Japanese media, not just the U.S. media, this was like even before the surrender, the Japanese media prohibited people from announcing the true effects of the bombs, and it was just like people were horrified, the survivors, looking at the things like, oh, they're treating this like it's not a big deal, like they just want to keep up home front morale no matter what, even though Japan was obviously losing. And they actually were, some of the authorities were considering surrender. One of the reasons the U.S. like thought they had to drop the bombs was because of like bad like translations. They like thought they were not considering it at all, but obviously they needed better Japanese translations at the time. Unfortunately, many like Americans did not know Japanese fluently at the time of World War II. There were, like, I believe, less than 100 people who were not of Japanese ancestry themselves who knew like fluent or even decent Japanese in the U.S. And the U.S. scientists did not study the potential effects of high-dose whole-body radiation before they released these deadly weapons, nor did they develop treatments for ensuing medical conditions, even though they obviously knew about things like dangers from like X-rays, cancer, radiation therapy, and the radiation exposure at test sites. And particularly, they told the bombers to, basically get the hell out of there within the first few seconds because they knew something was going to happen. But it's just like, oh, they're just like Japanese, because this like huge campaign during the war portraying them in this like disgusting racist fashion, like using like racial epithets to refer to them, and like even like respectable newspapers like calling them like JAPS or NIPS instead of like Japanese, this like kind of like monstering other of the enemy, which they did not do with like the white enemies, like for example like the Germans or the Italians. And these scientists, they assumed most of the radiation would be captured by the rising atomic cloud, and then everyone who like suffered like extreme full body radiation would be killed instantly. They just did not know. They just like blazed ahead with this and didn't even consider the human cost, unfortunately. And the reports of disease X, like radiation poisoning, which like for example their hair would fall out and little purple spots would appear, and just like vomiting and like diarrhea and bloating, just like horrible, horrible, horrible things. They were dismissed as Japanese propaganda and exaggeration, like a ploy for sympathy. And the rising death tolls were attributed to rescue workers just finding more corpses during the following weeks, not people dying from like things like radiation poisoning and such caused by this. And another like horrible effect, like some women who were like nursing their babies at the time, their babies got very sick and they felt like the baby was like sucking all the radiation poisoning out through the breast milk. Just like so many like horrible like tragic things, because people did not consider the human cost. Obviously they shouldn't have dropped the bombs in the first place, and they didn't even like select a military target to bomb. But just like so many like horrible, I can't say enough about like how like horrible and awful and like vile and grotesque the like health effects were. Obviously, and of course they destroyed all these buildings and infrastructure and such. And there was a strict gag order on all media, like for film, textbooks, newspaper stories, magazines, like novels, like nonfiction accounts, photos, mail, including like outgoing media, and like things being sent into Japan. And no one could even mention the censorship that existed, which was like horrible. It did lift a bit earlier for like American journalists and like people like traveling in Japan, but for the Japanese themselves, it like extended until the occupation ended. And then like finally people were able to like express it in film, and not always like necessarily like nonfiction accounts, like like releasing like hidden films or reporting the true extent of the bombings. Like for example, Godzilla was inspired by like what happened in nuclear war and other things, just like with themes heavily like influenced by what had happened to them. And unfortunately the U.S. occupation authorities seized a lot of like films and pictures and manuscripts, and they were held hostage for years. And some people never got them back or never saw them again in their lifetime, even though they eventually came out. Although some people, brave people, did elude the censorship by, like, for example, they would smuggle a microfilm or carbon copies or Morse code even after their master documents and notes and pictures and such had been seized, and Japanese scientists were forced to hand over their research on their work they were doing under and are forced to work under the U.S. team, which was like a great humiliation for them. And the Americans seized medical records, blood samples, autopsy specimens, tissue biopsies, and they were sent to the U.S. for further research to help Americans, not the Japanese actually suffering. That would be just too much. And American doctors photographed and examined hibakusha, which and they didn't even tell them why they were going there, what was going to happen, and they often violated modesty, like forcing young women to be seen naked by strange men and photographed and filmed. That was just a huge violation of modesty, and they didn't even receive medical treatment, emotional support, or explanations of what was going to happen. And I'm sorry, I forgot. I did bookmark a bunch of things in the book which I felt would be important or interesting to read. And here's Oh, it also does mention a number of doctors who were very, very brave and courageous and doing these important medical research throughout the war too. And also, it's interesting to note Nagasaki. It was at the time, I believe it probably might still be Japan's largest community of Christians, mostly Catholics, in the big Urakami Cathedral in the nearby Urakami Valley, where many people from Nagasaki had moved during the war. They ironically thought it would be safer there. It was almost totally destroyed, the walls knocked down, and they had to later rebuild it. And many of the people did keep their faith, but many of the people who were killed in Nagasaki were members of the clergy, as well as some Koreans and Chinese and allied prisoners of war. And so here's the one first excerpt I marked to read. On the evening of August 11th, someone gave Dr. Akizuki a copy of the Asahi Shimbun, and for the first time since the bombing, he glanced through the newspaper and briefly reconnected to the outside world. By candlelight, he read an article issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs that ostensibly informed readers about the new type bomb and about how to protect themselves in the event of such an attack. The article suggested that people find an air raid shelter with a roof, or if that wasn't possible, wrap themselves in a blanket or layers of clothes and turn off anything at home that could cause a fire. Akizuki's head spun. Unaware that the Japanese media was prohibited from announcing the true effects of the bombs, he could barely contain his rage. What was the use of a blanket or some clothing when everything would be burnt or charred in the brilliant heat of thousands of degrees centigrade, he thought. What opportunity did we have to go outside after putting out our kitchen fires when, in an instant, tens of thousands of homes became tinder dry and burst into flames? But there were hundreds of patients waiting for him, so Dr. Akizuki set down the newspaper and returned to the yard to treat them, while one of his tuberculosis patients held up a candle for him to see. At 11 p.m. the next night, his hands stiff from long hours of extractions and medical care, Akizuki stopped his work, lay down on the ground, pulled a blanket over his head, and cried. And here is a photo of a before and after of Nagasaki. You can really see the damage. It's absolutely this, basically totally flattened. And unfortunately, I didn't realize this either. Many people, obviously in the West and Japan, they would obviously know, but they know about Hiroshima, but they're not always so knowledgeable at Nagasaki. They might not even know it was bombed at all, let alone that it was just as horrific in its own way. And so that's some things really, really have to change. There just hasn't been a lot of education in America, particularly because of the ongoing propaganda. Many people unfortunately still believe that we had to drop the bombs, and it really wasn't that bad, and they're just fine because Pearl Harbor, and so two wrongs make a right and such that. And just here are some more things I marked out about the censorship. It's just absolutely horrifying. You can't just rephrase this in your own words. You just have to read the whole thing to express the full extent of it. Over the next week, General Farrell led a preliminary Manhattan Project investigation team to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Contrary to some Japanese officials' assessments, the U.S. scientists confirmed that although radiation levels were higher than normal at both cities' hypocenter areas and in regions where black rain had fallen, the levels were low enough to be safe for U.S. occupation troops. The scientists stayed on to conduct further research, and additional teams from the U.S. Army, Navy, and Strategic Bombing Survey arrived in Nagasaki and Hiroshima to document the effects of the bomb's blast, heat, and radiation as a means to support American nuclear weapons development and bolster U.S. civil defense measures against a potential atomic bomb attack. The outcomes of these studies were classified and barred from release. Many Japanese scientists who were conducting their own investigations in Nagasaki and Hiroshima initially offered and were later mandated to hand over their research to U.S. scientists. In some cases, they were ordered to give up their autonomy and work under the authority of a U.S. team. Some Japanese researchers, including Dr. Shirabi, were able to quietly continue their studies on atom bomb illnesses and mortality rates, though they could not publish their findings until after the occupation ended. In a policy of unmitigated appropriation, U.S. investigators seized bomb victims' medical records, autopsy specimens, blood samples, and tissue biopsies from both cities and shipped them to the United States for further analysis. American military police also arrested a Nippon Ahistorical Japanese film company crew as it was documenting Nagasaki's destruction and the impact of radiation exposure on survivors. All of the crew's footage of both Nagasaki and Hiroshima was confiscated, but when the U.S. teams recognized the black and white film's unparalleled value, impossible to duplicate until another atomic bomb is released under combat conditions, they ordered the Japanese filmmakers to complete their filming and edit the footage for submission to the United States. Pentagon officials screened the film in 1946 and denied its public release. General Farrell's reports to General Groves and numerous U.S. studies confirmed that horrific radiation illnesses and deaths were caused by initial radiation exposure from the bombings, but when Farrell returned to the United States, he, along with Groves and others, persisted in minimizing the illnesses and deaths from both initial and residual radiation exposure. The Japanese claim that people died from radiation, Groves said in a New York Times article. If this is true, the number was very small. To prove his point that residual radiation levels were safe in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Groves invited a group of reporters to witness ongoing readings of low radiation levels at the Trinity test bomb site in Alamogordo, New Mexico. In a strange contradiction, however, the journalists entering the site were required to put on white canvas coverings over their shoes to make certain that some of the radioactive material still present in the ground might not stick to our souls, one of them wrote. Without addressing this inconsistency, Groves again justified the bombings, telling the journalists, while many people were killed, many lives were saved, particularly American lives. A September 5th confidential memo from the U.S. War Department to American media outlets provided a final blow to open reporting on the bomb's radiation effects. The memo requested that all reports about the atomic bombs, particularly reports that included scientific or technical details, be approved by the War Department prior to publication in order to protect the military secrecy of the bomb. Typical of the era, U.S. media organizations complied almost uniformly, printing the government's press releases as they were written, with little question or opposition. In combination with censorship of the Japanese media, most reports about the human impact of the bombs were effectively suspended in both Japan and the United States. Later that year, General Groves testified before the U.S. Senate that death from high-dose radiation exposure is without undue suffering and a very pleasant way to die. Just like, oh, and here's the famous picture of Taniguchi. It's also been like reprinted in color many places. You can see, like, obviously that's just like the tip of the iceberg. It's just absolutely horrific what happened to this guy. This is a picture of the Urakami Cathedral right after the bombing. Just absolutely like horrific. This is another excerpt from the book. Absolutely looks like some really, really horrific revelations coming to light in this. It's just absolutely horrible. In the United States, while a terrifying truth about Japan's nuclear cataclysm continued to be obscured from American citizens, top U.S. military and government leaders conducted a new, hard-hitting media campaign to justify the use of the bombs and promote public support for nuclear weapons development, in what social activist A.J. Must called a demonstration of the logic of atrocity. The campaign's message was delivered through a new round of official denials of the impact of large-dose radiation exposure on hibakusha, combined with decisive statements that the bombs were an absolute military necessity that saved innumerable American lives and ended the war. Officials also deflected opposition to the bombs' use by making repeated statements that fueled U.S. wartime hatred and racism against Japan and built the foundation for justifying the bombings as righteous and deserving acts against a savage enemy. It is a matter of conjecture whether these efforts were needed to influence American sentiments. In the immediate post-war years, most Americans, even those who felt disquieted by the enormity of harm the bombs had caused, supported the use of the bombs for reasons that included hatred of Japan's brutality during the war, pervasive anti-Japanese racism, and huge relief that the war was over. Even so, in order to prevent potential questions about the necessity and morality of the bombs and abate disapproval of the nation's burgeoning nuclear weapons program, U.S. officials continued to limit American media access to Nagasaki and Hiroshima. With few exceptions, news stories out of the atomic bomb cities were abstract and impersonal, focusing on the rebuilding of the cities, healing and rebirth out of the atomic ashes, and potential reconciliation with the United States that, according to American journalists, many atomic bomb victims desired. Reporters typically reference the atomic bombings in the context of government calls for heightened civil defense policies, appeals for international control of atomic energy, or praise of U.S. scientific ingenuity and achievement. Photographs of the mushroom clouds became the iconic images of the atomic bombings, with no representation of the hundreds of thousands who died and suffered beneath them. Mainstream journalists rarely challenged the government's perspectives. In early 1946, however, a small number of articles in the national press criticized the U.S. nuclear weapons program and examined the ethical dilemmas of the U.S. decision to use the bombs. These articles sparked a heated national debate. No formal opposition movement came together, but that summer new editorials and commentaries disapproving the bombs' use on Japan, combined with an increased number of articles and books that explored the hibakusha experience, fostered new dialogues about the ethics of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Public engagement with the hibakusha experience swelled in August when, in a single issue, the New Yorker published John Hersey's new work, Hiroshima, a 68-page account of the Hiroshima atomic bombing through the eyes of 6 survivors. Hersey, a former war correspondent and Pulitzer Prize-winning fiction writer who had spent 3 weeks in Hiroshima in the spring of 1946, wrote a vivid nonfiction narrative that captured readers' imaginations, helping them to see Hiroshima as a real place and empathize with hibakusha as real people with families, homes, and jobs. Hiroshima's graphic descriptions of instantaneous death, human anguish, and the mysterious symptoms from radiation exposure evoked powerful emotional responses across the United States. The issue sold out at shops and newsstands, requests for reprints multiplied, and approximately 50 American newspapers republished the story in serial form. Albert Einstein ordered 1,000 copies. The Book of the Month Club distributed hundreds of thousands of copies free to its subscribers because, in the words of club president Harry Sherman, we find it hard to conceive of anything being written that can be of more importance at this moment to the human race. ABC Radio broadcast the entire text of Hiroshima in half-hour segments over 4 weeks. Letters, telegraphs, and postcards, most of which expressed approval of the story, poured into the New Yorker offices. By the end of October, Alfred A. Knopf had published Hiroshima in book form, and within 6 months, over 1 million copies were sold around the world. In Japan, however, the book was prohibited from publication for another 3 years, over concerns that Hersey's depictions might invite perceptions that the bombs were unduly cruel. Immediately following the publication of Hersey's article, statements by 2 influential figures that challenged U.S. justifications for using the bombs ignited further controversy. At a mid-September press conference about other naval matters, Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, was quoted as saying that the bombings were a mistake because at the time they were dropped, Japan was on the verge of surrender. 2 days later, a scathing essay in the Saturday Review by renowned journalist Norman Cousins presented readers with a series of pressing questions to blast open some of the unspoken realities of the atomic bombings and the implications of U.S. nuclear weapons development. Do we know, for example, that many thousands of human beings in Japan will die of cancer during the next few years because of radioactivity released by the bomb, Cousins asked? Do we know that the atomic bomb is in reality a death ray, and that the damage by blast and fire may be secondary to the damage caused by radiological assault upon human tissue? Apologists for the atomic bombings fought back, nervous that negative views of their decision to use the bombs might intensify public perceptions of the atomic attacks as immoral or even criminal, concerned that such sentiments would damage post-war international relations and threaten U.S. nuclear development, and eager to defend genuine beliefs that the bombs were necessary, government and military officials hurriedly strategized ways to prevent what they considered a distortion of history. Their plan, to effectively argue the necessity of the bombs and suppress objections to their use. In the words of Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, a longtime friend of former Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, their intention was to silence the opposition's sloppy sentimentality. Their efforts worked. 2 articles by prominent government officials published in late 1946 and early 1947 offered intelligent and persuasive, behind-the-scenes perspectives on the decision to use the bombs that effectively quelled civic dissent and directed focus away from personal stories of people who had experienced the bombs. The first article was authored by Carl T. Compton, president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a respected physicist who had helped develop the atomic bombs. In the December 1946 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, Compton compared the death toll and damages in Hiroshima and Nagasaki with those from the Tokyo firebombing raids, without mentioning the radiation effects and ongoing suffering caused by the atomic bombs. He provided casualty estimates for a land invasion of Japan had the war dragged on, claiming that the atomic bombs had prevented the loss of hundreds of thousands, perhaps several millions, of lives, both American and Japanese. By most historical accounts, these figures are far higher than those estimated by the U.S. military prior to the bombings. Compton concluded that using the bombs was the only rational decision U.S. leaders could make, that the delivery of the two bombs, one after the other, and the Emperor's decision to surrender less than a day after the Nagasaki bombing were evidence that the atomic bombs ended the war. In a short letter published in a later edition of the Atlantic Monthly, President Truman validated Compton's perspectives, describing his article as a fair analysis of the situation. Compton's Atlantic Monthly commentary set the stage for an extended article by former Secretary of War Stimson, published in Harper's Magazine in February 1947, which Secretary of State James Burns hoped would stop some of the idle talk by those who opposed the use of the bombs. Though a team of military and political leaders contributed to Stimson's final draft, it was Stimson himself who provided the rank, respect, and reasoned communication style to successfully shut down almost all public criticism of the bombs. With clarity and unquestionable authority, Stimson told American readers that during the war, the U.S. atomic bomb policy had been a simple one: to spare no effort in securing the earliest possible development of an atomic bomb in order to shorten the war, minimize destruction, and save American lives. Like Compton, however, Stimson omitted many critical facts that would have given American readers a more thorough grasp of the numerous and complex factors involved in choosing to use atomic weapons on Japan. He failed to include key officials' pre-bomb debates over modifying the unconditional surrender restriction that he himself had recognized as a possible key to bringing Japan to an earlier surrender. He explained that the Potsdam Declaration had provided adequate warning to Japan, but did not clarify that the declaration's wording made no reference to nuclear weapons. He justified the two cities' death tolls by comparing them to an estimate of more than 1 million American lives saved by avoiding a costly invasion, without mentioning the impact of the Soviet Union's entry into the war, which would have caused Japan to fight on two fronts, altered Allied invasion strategies, and possibly ended the war prior to Allied forces landing on Japan's main islands. In claiming that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were military targets, Stimson obscured the obvious fact that the atomic bombs did not discriminate between military and civilian locations and personnel, as they obliterated the two cities. Ultimately, Stimson claimed that the decision to use the bombs was the least abhorrent option that resulted in exactly what military and government officials intended: Japan's surrender without a U.S. and Allied invasion of Japan's main islands. By the article's conclusion, Stimson had shifted readers' moral focus to the United States' obligation to retain international control over nuclear technology, weapons development, and testing to prevent other countries from producing or using atomic weapons. Nuclear weapons in U.S. hands, he maintained, would keep the United States and the world safe. It would be decades before historians gained access to the internal memos and documents of Stimson and his team of contributors that would reveal the careful construction of the Secretary of War's arguments and the number of misstatements and omissions they contained. In the meantime, in the months following its publication, the Harper's article was reprinted in its entirety by numerous newspapers and magazines across the country and quoted at length by dozens more. By virtue of his authority and careful reasoning, Stimson had created a singular atomic bomb narrative with such moral certitude that it superseded all others and became deeply ingrained as the truth in American perception and memory. The atomic bombings ended the war and saved 1 million American lives. The U.S. government's campaign to justify the bombs in mute opposition had done its job. Media reports on the survivors' lives and the empathy they evoked virtually ceased, even with the popularity of Hersey's book. The combined impact of occupation censorship and U.S. justification and denial diminished Americans' atomic to grasp both the colossal scope of damages and death in Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the unpredictable and odious after-effects of radiation exposure. Referring to atomic bomb dissenters, McGeorge Bundy, a behind-the-scenes contributor to Stimson's article and co-author of Stimson's autobiography, remarked, "I think we deserve some sort of medal for reducing those particular chatterers to silence, just absolutely horrifying." And here is another example of what the bombed-out landscape looked like, and here's some examples of what, the Allied military occupation was doing that was an absolute, disrespect to the survivors and the victims. A small number of soldiers committed minor cultural infractions, such as wearing shoes while inside a tatami room. Other actions, however, were extremely offensive, including evicting Japanese residents from their Western-style homes in southern Nagasaki for use as private homes for American officers, and taking over other buildings as well for occupation offices and barracks. Another conspicuous act of insensitivity came that winter when two well-fed and healthy units of the 2nd Marine Division pitted themselves against each other in a New Year's Day football game, at a time when Nagasaki students and teachers found it almost unbearable to study and work in school buildings where so many of their friends and colleagues had died. Occupation leaders chose Atomic Athletic Field No. 2 for the game, the athletic field of a former Nagasaki high school, now designated for occupation troops' use. It was here 5 months earlier, that hundreds of adults and children had been laid in rows, wounded and dying. Yoshida was among them. His parents had found him here on the day after the bombing, his face scorched and his eyes swollen shut. To prepare for the event, U.S. soldiers used scrap wood to construct goalposts and bleachers. On game day, spurred on by a Marine band, thousands of occupation troops gathered to watch the team's battle for victory. Fragments of glass from the school's shattered windows still covered the field. So tackling was replaced by a two-hand touch. The Americans called the game the Atom Bowl. Perhaps the Americans' most egregious activities took place in the Urakami Valley, although General Groves and others had repeatedly denied that dangerous residual radiation was present in Nagasaki. The hypocenter area was cordoned off, and U.S. troops were ordered not to enter the area. What that meant, however, was that everybody and his brother headed directly for Ground Zero, one soldier remembered. Looting for atomic keepsakes was strictly forbidden and punishable by court-martial, but some soldiers rifled through the ruins for anything they could find that they could bring home as war trophies. Moreover, when American troops built an airstrip in the northwest corner of the valley, nicknamed Atomic Field, they used bulldozers to clear the ruins, crushing human bones scattered in the debris. There were still many dead under the rubbish, 15-year-old Uchida Tsukasa remembered. Despite that, the Americans drove their bulldozers very fast, treating the bones of the dead just the same as sand or soil. They carried the soil to lower places and used it to broaden roads there. Hayashi Shigeo, a prodigious photographer dispatched by Tokyo's Ministry of Education, was threatened at gunpoint by a U.S. military police officer when he tried to take a photograph of an American bulldozer dropping victims' bodies into a ditch. Both incidents, people who lived in the area and those whose family members' homes' bones were buried in the debris could only stand by, outraged and helpless. And just like the entire book is full of, like horrifying stories like that, like things many people just genuinely aren't aware of, like even maybe in Japan themselves. And like another thing, like they talked about, like the Smithsonian was putting together like a thing for the 50th anniversary of the bombings in the 1990s, and like veterans and older people absolutely outraged, but they were planning to like show like photographs of the aftermath, like, oh, how dare you say the bombs might not have been necessary, like, our country right or wrong, I'm a Stephen Decatur jingoist, like things like that. And they eventually got the exhibit entirely shut down because they just didn't, want to compromise, instead of like, it's like mindless, like jingoistic crap, like repeating the propaganda from the 1940s, like one of many reasons I just really hate, like, like jingoism, and like just don't understand why so many Americans are, like so precious about like our country right or wrong crap. And another really horrifying thing I found on this book, like the cremated remains of like hibakusha, when they like open them for like, family mourning ceremonies and like, celebrations of like, their death anniversary, to honor them, they had turned black, and like the normal cremated like ashes from a human should be like white or like a light pinkish color, maybe like very light tan, but they had like turned like completely black, which is completely abnormal, which shows like the bombs had like penetrated right down to the cellular and bone level, just like so many horrifying things. So thank you very much for listening to the end. This video did turn out a bit longer than I had expected, but hopefully if you watched this long, you really like appreciated and learned some new things from it. Thank you to all my new subscribers. I'm very glad I finally have gone over 100, and please consider leaving a comment. I really want to get to know you guys and make more friends on BookTube and AuthorTube. And thank you again very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.